Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing well. We have the true honor and privilege to be joined by Michael Paarlberg. He's going to talk to us on about gangs, crime, and the Bukele model in the case of El Salvador. He is a distinguished scholar. He's written extensively on numerous topics related to Latin America, gangs, crime, immigration. He's an associate professor at Virginia Commonwealth University. He's a senior non-resident fellow at the Center for International Policy. And he's worked extensively in the region. He was a chief Latin American policy advisor to the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2020, a former journalist for The Guardian, and he's published regularly in addition to leading journals on numerous topics with very sophisticated methodologies. Academic journals. He's also published in news outlets such as Foreign Policy, Slate, El Faro, which is from Salvador, the Washington Post, among others. So we're really, really honored to have this distinguished guest join us today. And again, just a leading scholar and wealth of knowledge. So thank you so much, Michael, for joining us to talk about gangs in El Salvador.
Well, thanks for having me, Jonathan, and thanks for that really generous intro.
Awesome. So before we get started, out of all things, how did you become interested in this area?
Yeah, almost by accident. So I'm not Latin American, I'm Korean American. I lived in Panama as a kid because my father was in the Foreign Service, and so I learned Spanish in like middle school, high school, just by living in Panama. And so I was interested in Central America, although Panama is, as I joke, more, historically South American, culturally more Caribbean than it is Central American. But I was originally researching not crime, but migration. And so I was interested in looking at, for my PhD, for my dissertation, areas in countries with high rates of migration to the United States, specifically to the Washington, D.C. area where I'm from. And so El Salvador is one of them. I also looked at Mexico, the Dominican Republic, and spent time in those too. But I spent the most time in El Salvador, and I ended up going to the capital, but also through work with the Organization of American States, spent time in the east of the country in a state called San Miguel, which is the area of the highest rate of migration in the United States. And coincidentally was also a stronghold of MS-13. And so
Mhm.
that was something that was very apparent when I was there. Now, this was around 2014, 2015. So El Salvador, very sadly, was known as the murder capital of the world around then. So that's when murders hit their peak. And it was, hard not to ignore. There were just lots of stories about, the gangs going to war over controlling the bus routes and doing horrific, really, terroristic things like killing everyone on the bus to try to intimidate the bus companies to pay their extortion. And of course, there was graffiti and everything like that. It was also coincidentally the time of the rise of Nayib Bukele as a political figure. He was the mayor of San Salvador when I was living there, and I was actually living across the street from one of his businesses. He ran the Yamaha franchise in El Salvador among his many businesses, although his main business was always publicity, and you can see that in his governing style. So I've been tracking his political rise for a long time, and so I was looking at both of those things, and I was interested in particular about how crime drives migration, how it is that so many people uh, ended up fleeing the gangs. How do the gangs end up there in the first place? How do the gangs operate? How is it the way that the gangs operate? Uh, how is that different from the way maybe cartels or mafias or other maybe more familiar models of transnational organized crime operate? And that's what I wrote the chapter for your book about how the maras, how the gangs of Central America really do not fit in many ways the familiar models. So it really kind of morphed my research project to be from primarily about migration to being about migration and crime, and specifically about gangs.
Yeah, fascinating. And I encourage the audience to read your work. It's very, very accessible and really, really fascinating research with different types of methodologies. So I definitely encourage everyone to read your work. So can you talk a little bit about, we'll delve into this more when we talk about the case of Bukele, but can you talk a little bit about the current political and security landscape in El Salvador today? As you mentioned, in 2015, El Salvador had a homicide rate of 103 per 100,000, making it the most violent non-warring country in the world. Today, you've seen this kind of discussion or question is El Salvador the safest country in the world, right? Homicides have gone down. Where are we kind of in the current security and crime landscape and political landscape in the country?
Well, political landscape, I think we can return to that topic a little bit, but in
Sure.
short, El Salvador is a de facto one-party state. So it has gone from uh, a pretty institutionalized two-party system that came out of the 12-year Civil War that ended in 1992, which was a little bit freewheeling, chaotic, corrupt, but not in danger of going back to civil war and not, uh, not authoritarian. It shifted from that to under Bukele now effectively one-party control under an authoritarian state with a strongman president who has greatly expanded the powers of the executive and greatly diminished any kinds of checks and balances to his power. In terms of the security situation has, according to the raw numbers, improved. Now, that improvement has been over a long period of time, and much of that time was before Bukele. So, as I alluded to when I was there 2015, that's when murders hit their peak. That means they've been dropping since 2015, which is 11 years ago. So they've been dropping for over a decade. If you actually look at the overall drop in the homicide rate, it was actually a sharper drop under Bukele's predecessor, Salvador Sanchez-Cerén, than it wasn't under Bukele. It actually dropped more. It's just Sanchez-Cerén doesn't get credit for this because he was also president when they hit their peak. So, and I'm not saying that he had the magic solution. It's just that the murder rates have fluctuated over time, and it's hard to give all credit to a single individual. But they have been dropping since 2015. Bukele came into office in 2019. I was there for his election. And now, for the last 4 years, El Salvador's been under what's called a state of exception. And so Bukele and much of the foreign media credits the drop in homicides to Bukele's state of exception. But the state of exception has only been in place since 2022. Murder rate's been dropping since 2015. And even under Bukele, the larger drop in the murder rate happened before the state of exception, oddly enough, when we now know, thanks to a lot of reporting and the Department of Justice's uh, case under the Vulcan Task Force, that Bukele had a deal with the gang, specifically with MS-13. And so under the gang pact, the murder rate dropped even more than it did under the current state of exception. So basically, there have been a lot of things that have been happening that have helped lower the murder rate. Um, Part of that is making deals with the gangs. And these deals have come to light. They involved giving the gangs perks for imprisoned gang leaders, like conjugal visits and better food and PlayStations and whatnot. It also involved just paying them off in cash. And the gangs working for the ruling party and giving exclusive access to their neighborhoods, doing voter turnout, intimidating opposition parties. And this held until about 2022. And then the gangs killed 87 people in one weekend because Bukele's government stopped their cash payments. They thought that the violence would push the government back to the table. Instead, the government instituted a state of exception and started locking up a lot of people, but also suspending civil liberties more generally, and the murder rate dropped further. Now, we also know that the murder rate has been manipulated. So this has come out in what's called the Guacamaya leaks, which is kind of like a WikiLeaks for Latin America, which leaked police communication data, which indicates that the police are hiding, or at one point at least, were hiding about half the murders. We know that disappearances, just as the murder rate started to really drop, disappearances were going up at about a proportional rate. There have been periodic discoveries of mass graves, including one that was only a mile from Bukele's house. And there has been efforts by the government to discourage people from reporting disappearances. And so this points to something much more sinister, which is that as part of the gang pact, the government was encouraging the gangs to hide the bodies better. And then, do a better job hiding the bodies. We won't try too hard to look for them. This was also revealed by a gang leader from Barrio 18 who spoke to Alfaro, saying that he was told by a top Bukele official who is currently under Treasury sanctions basically said like no body, no crime. So I think there's a lot to the so-called Bukele model. what we are told is only one side of it, which is locking up a bunch of people. But as we'll probably get into in this conversation, locking up a lot of people is a common uh, approach to policing in Central America and has not been that effective, at least in the long term, even though it's always popular in the short term. But it's all the other stuff that's going on behind the scenes that has made this policing approach unique. And one could argue, uniquely successful. But I would say successful more in the political realm than necessarily the factual realm when it comes to figures.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the audience, I'd encourage them to check out the piece by Alfaro, which, kind of broke the story about negotiating with the gangs, MS-13 in particular, for a year. And then, as you mentioned, the U.S. government and the Treasury Department sanctioned part of the Bukele administration for these negotiations and document this quite extensively. And the last comment before the next question is, I think you bring up a really great point. There's been a lot of criticism, and the Washington office on Latin America has documented this extensively about the lack of transparency of the Bukele administration in terms of data, sharing data, calculations, and as you mentioned, kind of the forced disappearances. How do you calculate those numbers? And so I think you bring up a really brilliant point about this deal, this negotiation, and the effort to hide bodies. So can you talk a little bit about Mano Salvatrucha or MS-13 and Barrio 18 or the 18th Street Gang and how they kind of evolved over time?
Yeah, so there's a lot of myths about these gangs. I mean, they came onto the public's radar largely in the first Trump administration because uh, especially MS-13, became this bogeyman and a kind of stand-in for crime associated with immigrants, immigrant organized crime, which is by itself a misdirection because MS-13 did not come from Central America. It was born in the United States, specifically in Los Angeles. Now, it was transnational in the sense that people who were fleeing the Civil War in the 1980s and early 90s were coming to the U.S., ended up in different parts of the U.S. Salvadorans especially settled in Los Angeles, Washington, D.C. area, also Long Island, New York, Houston, Texas, and other places. But the largest contingent went to Southern California. Now, there's a lot of street folklore about the gang, which you're familiar with, and I've written about in various outlets, and it's hard to be 100% sure that all this is true. But according to the gang lore, according to them, they were newcomers in these neighborhoods in LA and were picked on by established gangs, which are mostly Chicano gangs, which say Mexican American gangs. And despite the fact of the, shared language and in some way they did not get along, the Chicanos picked on the Central Americans. And so the Central Americans formed gangs, as they say, in self-defense. And so MS-13 was formed. It was originally called the Mara Salvatrucha Stoners, which tells you about how serious they were, right? They were a bunch of teenage juvenile delinquents who hung out and smoked pot, and they liked heavy metal. This is another thing that distinguished them from the established gangs. They just dressed differently. They dressed like metalheads. They would have long hair and skinny black jeans, and this is something that was not common uh, in LA gangland at the time. Uh, Barrio 18, which is known as 18th Street in the U.S., that says something about the name, right? It's an actual street in the Pico Union district of Los Angeles. That was an established gang that has its roots back in the 60s, but it was one of the few Chicano gangs that allowed Central Americans to join, and so many of them joined, and it kind of de facto became a Central American uh, refugee gang. And then the two gangs were basically they had an alliance. They got along. And then, according to the gang lore, someone stole someone else's girlfriend, and there was a fight at a party, and then the two gangs have been at war ever since. I'm sure there's more to that story that we don't know about. But in any case, they were at that time. This would have been the 1980s, 1990s, Los Angeles. They were not terribly dangerous. They were, as I said, a bunch of they were a street gang that was limited to one city in the United States. It was a juvenile gang, so they were doing things that juveniles do, like sell drugs, but they were not a mafia. They were not, terribly sophisticated. And in fact, they never actually became that sophisticated. I hope MS-13 is not watching this. But they transformed from a street gang into a prison gang, thanks to policing efforts of the Los Angeles Police Department. particularly in the 1980s. 1984, there was the Summer Olympics. Were in Los Angeles. The LAPD had a mandate to clean up the streets as they saw it, so they were just doing mass arrests of, mostly teenagers, and targeting especially, Black and Latino teenagers. And a lot of them ended up in the California prison system. And this is how the Mara Salvatrucha stoners transform themselves into just Mara Salvatrucha and then MS-13. 13 being a tribute to an established prison gang known as the Mexican Mafia, which, despite its name, is not from Mexico, from California. And uh, and even then, they were still largely confined to California, to the California streets and the prison system. The second transformation that took place was in the 1990s, specifically 1996. President Clinton signed a pair of laws, the most notable being what's known by its acronym IRA, which greatly increased the number of deportations to every country, but basically by lowering the bar for what counts as a deportable crime. So this is basically what inaugurated our current era of mass deportations, which may surprise some people to know. It happened under a Democratic president, not under a Republican. And so all of a sudden, countries like El Salvador, also Guatemala, Honduras, were being inundated with, every day they get a plane of people who were being sent back to a country that they didn't really know. Many of them left as kids, so a lot of them didn't speak Spanish. They're certainly not socialized into Salvadoran or Guatemalan society, and all the people there were scared of them because they'd been told by the U.S. government that all of these people are dangerous criminals, even if all they did was steal a car or sell pot on the streets. They were told these were hardened gangbangers. And as we know, the majority of people who are deported, including those who are deported for criminal offenses, are not being deported for gang offenses. A lot of these people deported for drunk driving or something like that. But there were some gang members in the mix. And they ended up in a country that had far fewer resources, policing resources, than the U.S. They didn't have any jobs waiting for them. No one wanted to hire them. So they reconstituted their gangs in El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras. And then they preyed on the other deportees who also didn't have jobs waiting for them and were stigmatized. So the gangs metastasized quite quickly in that environment. The government didn't know what to do. It took a version of what we now refer to as mano dura policing, just locked them all up. And that just meant the gangs basically took over the prison system there. And so they became much more powerful and much more dangerous in Central America than they ever were in the United States, in which they were really a pretty controlled group. Even in the U.S., the FBI stopped doing gang size assessments a while ago, but the last time they did an assessment of MS-13's membership in the United States, they said it was roughly 10,000, which is a very round number. And that may sound like a lot, but that's really tiny compared to every other gang like you've heard of, the Bloods, the Crips. There's even a single gang in the state of Texas called Tango Blast that has more members, like twice as many members in just Texas alone than MS-13 has in all the United States, according to the FBI. So it was never really, obviously they do commit crimes, and including violent crimes, and they do go to jail for those. But the U.S. has had a handle on MS-13 and Barrio for a while now. And yet they were able to take over effectively, entire neighborhoods in areas that had little state presence and weak and corrupt institutions, especially police institutions. And so they did become a serious crime problem, and were able to exert their power through the increase in the homicide rate, which is something that governments have been very sensitive to. And people have run for president on the promise to crack down on crime and keep down homicides. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think that the same statistics you're citing, Barrio 18, there's twice as many cited in the United States as MS-13. In that same report, the FBI, I think they cite 33,000 gangs and 1.4 million gang members. So in the grand scheme of things, 10,000 is quite quite small, right? When you go to El Salvador, most estimates are 70 to 80,000 gangs, and then 450,000 people, according to the police, with ties to gangs in a country that only has 6 million people. So I think it's really, really important, as you mentioned, to point out the actual kind of myths versus the realities. So you talked a little bit about mano dura, which, in English would be kind of iron fist or hardline strategies, which the Salvadoran government's really been implementing since the early 2000s. Then we kind of saw the super mano dura. What is mano dura and what have kind of been the consequences of these strategies?
As you point out, mano dura is not a new idea. It's actually really the norm of policing. It is
Yeah.
a kind of at this point empty signifier. It just means, as you said, iron fist policing, zero tolerance policing. It has been implemented by various administrations in El Salvador. And when, as you said, when it didn't work, then they brought it back. So let's call it super mano dura. And I was thinking maybe the next time they'll call it super mano dura. But it just means lowering the bar for arrests and and flooding the streets with police, and in some cases, including under a left-wing government of the one previous to Bukele, creating effectively extrajudicial death squads, made up of police, soldiers, some civilians that would just kill people extrajudicially who were suspected of gang membership. So these methods have not at all been legal necessarily, but they would have mixed effectiveness. The thing is, as I alluded to earlier, they're never implemented alone, and they don't exist in a vacuum. They're always implemented as the stick part to a carrot and stick approach. And the governments will have always, Bukele's not the only one to do this, negotiated with the gangs, alternating with these heavy crackdowns. And the thing is, both of these things are effective strategies to a degree. When they do flood the streets with police, obviously, the gangs go into hiding. It interrupts their extortion rackets. This is the other thing. The gang's bread and butter is extortion. It's not the production of drugs or the trafficking of drugs across borders. It's really, this is one of the things that makes them so pernicious. It's preying on regular people, poor people, people who just live in these poor neighborhoods, street vendors, people who run small businesses. So, they really are, people hate them for good reason, right? Because they're victimizing poor people. But mano dura approaches do temporarily suppress the street activity of gangs. They do, they also push the gangs' activities into the prisons, and then they direct their activities from the prisons. But then also, it's also effective to negotiate with the gangs, and they would give the gangs these perks, and so again, Bukele is not the only one to do that. He in fact inherited a lot of these relationships, both his own from when he was mayor of San Salvador and worked with Barrio for a real estate refurbishing deal of a downtown shopping center, um, but also from previous administrations. And so all of these things work to some degree, but then eventually the mano dura regime lifts, or the negotiations with the gangs become exposed. This happened under Mauricio Funes, who the last time, this is 2012, there was a big secret pact with the gangs. It did bring down the murder rate, and that's what helped his chosen successor become elected. But then it came out that there was this deal, and it became politically impossible to sustain because of the outrage about this. And so then his successor said, "Okay, gloves are off. We're going back to mano dura," and then the murder rate shot up before coming back down again. Uh, so one thing I think I want to stress, though, that's unique about the Bukele model is it isn't just mano dura. So there's this, I think it's often misreported that the state of exception, the, régimen de excepción, is a mano dura model, but it's not that. It's much more than that. So Bukele is not, they describe it as an anti-gang model. So Bukele already had an anti-gang policing model. He called it the Plan Control Territorial, which was the territorial control plan, which is basically just an extension of mano dura. It was the same thing, like put cops in the streets, lock a lot of people up, but it wasn't the same thing as what he did starting in March, April 2022. The state of exception is not a policing strategy aimed at gangs. It is a general suspension of civil liberties aimed at the entire population. It is a suspension of habeas corpus, But it also involved, firing a third of the judges in the country. It involved sending the military to go into the legislature to intimidate lawmakers into passing a bill. Involved jailing not just gang members, we can talk about who's actually being jailed, but also opposition politicians, heads of NGOs, so these are all things that are new. Like that's previous administrations that cracked down on gangs didn't jail the opposition. So this is this is not an anti-crime measure. This is the use of the crime issue for political purposes. And that political purpose is the consolidation of power, the concentration of power within the executive, and the transformation of El Salvador into a one-party state.
So you've talked about Bukele and his crackdowns. I'll give you one. So maybe we can talk a little about the rise of Bukele, and I'll give you one quick anecdote. So I was actually at the event when he spoke with Alfaro, right? When he was the mayor, and it was so interesting. Um, that he would talk about prevention in Medellin, what they were doing with gangs, a very different tone, right? At least in terms of his discourse when he was the mayor. And then you've seen, as you mentioned, this kind of state of exception, the crackdowns, and also this concentration of power. So, can you talk maybe a little bit about the rise of Bukele? And also this notion of the concentration of power. Are we experiencing or seeing El Salvador experience a democratic backsliding?
So I would say yes, it's clearly, and it's not just me saying this. I think uh, all the institutions that measure civil liberties and democracies have noticed a significant decline in El Salvador, like Freedom House and Varieties of Democracy, and uh, all of them. Bukele himself he's a fascinating figure. He's a bit of a nepo baby, so he's not a self-made man. His father was. Um, he is definitely elite and rich, but did not come from the traditional elite. In El Salvador, like a lot of countries in Central America, had quite unequal distribution of wealth that comes from a very historic unequal distribution of land. And there were these oligarchic families known as Las Catorce, the 14 families, and Bukele is not one of them. The Bukele family is an immigrant family originally. So the Bukeles are Palestinian uh, immigrants. And El Salvador, next to Chile and Honduras, has the largest Palestinian population in Latin America. I've actually written about this. I've written about the Palestinian diaspora in Latin America and comparing the Central American Palestinian diaspora to the Chilean diaspora, which is the largest in the world outside of the Middle East. Um, so his family would have been considered by the old money, kind of like new money, the nouveau riche, and his father was a successful business owner, ran a lot of businesses, but he was also unique in the sense that he supported the left politically. So Bukele comes from a left-wing background, not a right-wing background, even though he's now very popular with the CPAC crowd and with the Trump administration. His father was really the chief fundraiser for the FMLN, which was the historic left-wing party that started as a guerrilla movement that was trying to overthrow the U.S. allied Salvadoran government in the 1980s, 1992 Civil War. And he was in that way kind of somewhat like a black sheep of the business community. Um, and his sons were running different aspects of the family business, and Nayib became the really the PR person and took that to heart. But he later used that to launch a political career. But that political career was with the left-wing party, with the FMLN. He became first the mayor of Nuevo Cuscatlan, which is a small city outside of San Salvador, and then later became the mayor of the capital of San Salvador, which has always been a springboard to the presidency. So he was with the left, and he at the time was very vocally left wing. You can find old tweets of him where he tweets images of Che Guevara and Fidel Castro. And when Hugo Chavez died, he tweeted a really nice eulogy to Hugo Chavez. And I know people who went to high school with Bukele and say that he was, quite enamored by the Cuban model and by Fidel Castro in particular. Now, it seems that what enamored him of them was not their socialism, so to speak, but more their authoritarianism, more the fact that they were strong men, and willing to, use power ruthlessly. Um, so Bukele was a member of the left-wing party and running with the left, but he was not never a loyal member. He was always someone who wanted to do his own rules. And the FMLN and its right-wing rival Arena, these were two very institutionalized parties. They had a very disciplined cadre base. They had a clear, you know, leadership command structure. They had a way to rise through the ranks. These are really like we hear about this in political science, the kind of classic kind of 19th and early 20th century European parties, the class mass parties. It's like they have like mass memberships and they're involved in all aspects of society. They run sports leagues and do political education and things like that. They don't exist anymore in Europe. For the most part, but they did exist for a while in Latin America. And Arena FMLN were these two, deeply institutionalized parties. But So they had a lot of rules, and Bukele didn't want to follow those rules, and so he'd always brand him. He would make his own marketing, obviously, and like use his own color scheme, not the colors of the party. And these seem like small things, but someone in the publicity uh, profession, these are important details. And it seemed like his star was rising, that he wanted to run for president, but he wanted to, jump the line, so to speak. And he got in a lot of fights with other members of the party, and eventually he was expelled from that party, officially for what is termed sexual harassment. He yelled or was abusive towards other members of the party who were women. It seems at that point Bukele was already ready to go and was maybe using you know, that rift as an excuse to leave, and he wanted to form his own party. It took him a while to do that. So when he eventually ran for president in 2019, he ran with an existing smaller right-wing party called Ghana. But then once he got into office, he was able to form his own party. That party now has a broad supermajority in the legislature. It controls most of the mayorships in the country. It has effectively squashed the remaining parties you know, using authoritarian tactics. And so effectively, it's the only viable party in the country now.
Right. And it would be the Nuevas Ideas, New Ideas
Yeah,
Party, as you
yeah,
mentioned.
ideas.
So, yeah. And so, when you talk, really fascinating, when you talk a little bit about um, Bukele in many ways, is unbelievably popular, right? Polling, in the high 80s at times, some it's hovering around 90s at certain point. Um, and you do get the sense that in terms of his marketing capabilities on Twitter, I guess formerly Twitter, now X, even if you look at CECOT, right, this maximum security prison, the way he frames it, and so he does have a lot of fans in El Salvador. Can you talk a little bit about this notion that he's kind of perceived among some, particularly the right, as the savior of here's the model of how to solve crime, right? Here's a model of how to solve gangs. As you mentioned, critics have pointed out the arrest of people that before were, I mean, Ruth Lopez, very well-known lawyers, advocates, human rights defenders, journalists, right, fleeing the country from the far where they're going to be arrested. And you talk so eloquently about the backsliding, the anti-democratic practices, but how do you kind of evaluate this notion in other countries in Latin America that this has become this Bukele model, right? We've seen Honduras kind of playing with the idea, Costa Rica, other countries. That even typically don't really have such high levels of crime or gang activity and violence. You've seen particularly kind of right and sometimes far right candidates running on this notion. How do you assess this notion? And is it troubling for the region? Is there fears that this leads to this rise of potential, as you mentioned, authoritarian leaning or authoritarian tendencies? Is some ways the Bukele model a way also to just concentrate power, to jail enemies, to jail opposition? How do you assess this kind of notion of the viability of this Bukele model and this discussion that we're seeing around the Americas?
Well, just to first address the popularity, so there's often polls that come out that put Bukele at over 80% approval. However, those polls will also ask people, do you feel comfortable voicing an opinion that is critical of the government? And the
Right.
same percentage, over 80%, say, no, I do not. Which, these things can both be true and are usually true in authoritarian contexts. I'm sure if you took a poll in North Korea, you would find that Kim Jong-un has like 105% approval, right? And Bukele brags about this, about being, one of the most popular leaders in the world. And he says, look at this list, the rankings. And it's like Bukele and then like Putin and then, I don't know, Lukashenko in Belarus or something like that. It's like all a bunch of dictatorships. And how meaningful are polls in authoritarian contexts where people don't feel safe to voice their opinion? Now, it's also probably true that a lot of people, there's a lot of people, who knows exactly how many, but if I were to like give a rough estimate, 40% of the country absolutely love him and think that that everything he's doing is great. And 20% absolutely hate him. And then another 40% are just, they don't see any alternative. And that's what Bukele's been very good at doing. If for you to oppose a government, I think you have to have in mind at least another candidate or some alternative to them. And Bukele's made it impossible for anyone to challenge him, or even a party to really organize an effective opposition campaign. So I think for a lot of people, he's just the default leader, and I think he wants to uh, keep that. I think that's what's the real value of the state of exception to him, is to keep the opposition cowed so that there can be no viable alternative to him. Now, in terms of the crime model, as I alluded to, uh, what we see on TV is not the whole model. And so, as you've alluded to, this has been tried, explicitly as a state of exception in countries like Honduras and Ecuador, and it has not worked. They have not seen the same drop in homicides. They wonder, like, why is this? Well, it's because they're only instituting the stick part of the carrot and stick approach. They're only locking up a bunch of teenagers. And that has been done before in El Salvador as well. It hasn't had the same results. It's all the other stuff that has to go along with it, cutting deals with the gangs, encouraging them to hide bodies, not looking for disappearances too hard, manipulating the murder stats, and making sure that the world sees a certain side that is only one part of that model. So you bring up CECOT, the anti-terrorism confinement center, the mega prison.
Right.
And this is the one prison that you see on TV in the U.S. and social media. Uh, it's a real misdirection because everyone being arrested under the state exception are not going to that prison. They're going to all the other prisons in El Salvador, which are actually worse. The conditions are actually worse because they are older and more crowded. CECOT was built to transfer existing prisoners from those prisons into one place, and that was meant to house, to jail the most dangerous gang members, the ones who were uh, you know lifers. And if you look at the images, which these are released by the Salvadoran government. These were not taken surreptitiously by investigative journalists, right? The government is proud of this. You'll see dozens of heavily tattooed men in their underwear being treated roughly, being stacked up like sardines for a photo op. And they do look scary in the sense that a lot of them have full body tattoos, including face tattoos. But if you look closely, you'll see that they're all middle-aged men. They're all in their 40s and 50s. They are not the teenage, the median age for a gang member is about 15. So these are not the 15-year-olds who are being locked up under the state of exception. These are people who have been in prison for decades, as in they've been in prison before Bukele. These are people, all these people were arrested by some other government prior to Bukele. And he is using this image to scare people abroad, both foreign governments and just regular news consumers, but also specifically to cater to the Salvadoran diaspora, because the diaspora left 10, 20 years ago, and they remember this image. The thing is, this image is out of date. When I was doing my research in San Miguel, which again, MS-13 territory, there we knew MS-13 was around, but no one had face tattoos because over 10 years ago, really 15 years ago, the gangs instituted a policy, and they said we're not going to have you get tattoos anymore, not face tattoos, not tattoos at all, because obviously it makes you easier to target. Now, of course, there's reasons why they did the heavy tattooing thing. It marks you as a pariah from society. You're never going to get a real job. But then, of course, if you want to infiltrate the police or infiltrate the local government, which the gang certainly had done at that point, you can't have a giant, 13 on your MS on your face or 18 on your face. And so this is an outdated image, but it harkens back to a time before Bukele, well before Bukele, when El Salvador was the murder capital of the world, and when these gangs were quite visible, and this is something that helps make a make a bid to the diaspora that, look, I am doing something about these people, whereas in fact those people had already been locked up.
Yeah, absolutely. So, final question. What do you see going forward as the biggest kind of political and security challenges in El Salvador?
Well, El Salvador has a lot of challenges. I mean, every country has its challenges, but I think that a lot of what's not being talked about is all the other stuff, which is what Bukele wouldn't want to talk about, especially the economics of it. El Salvador is has a very weak economy. It's deeply in debt. Its public debt has at many times approached 100% of its GDP. Its operating budget is entirely dependent on foreign loans, just like pay public servants. And Bukele has uh, faced insolvency for many times in his presidency, and he's had to steal money from workers' pension funds in order to cover salaries. Unemployment is stubbornly high, and inflation is going up quite a lot. A lot of Salvadorans have been complaining about increasing costs of not just fuel, which we're seeing worldwide, but including of housing. And so this is on top of the ongoing corruption issues, which have affected every administration, but continue to affect the Bukele administration. And so he recruited from, despite saying that he was going to end the los mismos de siempre, like the same people as always, he ended up hiring many of los mismos de siempre from past administrations, both left wing and right. And these are people who have ties to the gangs themselves, including his attorney general, his minister of security have worked as, effectively gang lawyers in the past. Minister of Housing has ties to Coyote Ring. A lot of people have ties to money laundering rings. The government as a whole has had ties to PDVSA and used a subsidiary of PDVSA called ALBA to launder money in violation of U.S. Treasury sanctions on behalf of the Venezuelan government, which seems like a strange bedfellow situation, given that El Salvador's government now is on the right. But this is all to say these ongoing issues of unemployment, inflation, corruption, the kinds of things that really that have unseated presidents in the past have been papered over by the state of exception, which has been renewed. I've lost count of how many times, but it's going on.
More
Supposedly
than
it's
30. Yeah,
going
more
on.
than 30.
Yeah, it's been going on for 4 years now. Um, the question is, how long can that really last? Another thing that's a wild card is the deportation issue. So, Bukele has backed Trump to the hilt, including Trump's promises mass deportations. If that happens, that would be catastrophic for the Salvadoran economy, given that El Salvador's GDP, 25% of its GDP comes from remittances sent by Salvadorans in the U.S. So if all of a sudden all the Salvadorans in the U.S. are forced to return home, they're going to lose. That's many magnitudes more than the US, than El Salvador gets from foreign direct investment, for example. Certainly more than foreign assistance. So that would be a major source of revenue just gone, and not just for the government, but for regular families. And we're also seeing the state of exception itself uh, hurt regular families. So the government has announced that they're just not going to feed prisoners. Bukele has tweeted this, has said that it's a main way of disciplining the inmate population, so they only give them one meal a day. And so about a third of the country knows someone who's been arrested, and I'm sure that a lot of them know that they're not all guilty. I mean, there have been estimates ranging anywhere from 30 to as much as 70% of people arrested are not gang members, are innocent, in fact. And of course, they're being held and they're not even tried. They're being held in indefinite pretrial detention. The few that are tried in these mass trials with like 95% conviction rates. So people are trying to keep their loved ones alive behind bars, and they're sending care packages of food so they can eat, and they're sending bribes to corrections officers to try to get them slightly better care. Now they can't communicate with their family members. Probably you can imagine the likelihood of theft, embezzlement is quite high when they don't. A lot of people are probably sending money and food to people who are already dead, and they don't know. But people have been complaining that the amount of that they are spending on bribes and care packages is equal to the amount of money that they were paying to the gangs when the gangs were extorting them. So you're seeing in this sense the state in many ways, and so I've written about this, I call it the gang state model is kind of a play on narco state because they're not exactly, mafias, but the state taking the role of the gangs in terms of de facto extorting families and then engaging or absorbing higher levels of crime like money laundering at an official level in ways that criminal organizations would have otherwise done. So I don't know how long that is going to be politically feasible, sustainable. I think that uh, you know getting tough on crime is definitely popular. It's popular in every country. We can see in Mexico, for example, Sheinbaum has seen a quite sharp drop in crime, doing things that are a little bit more sophisticated. Now, the cartels in Mexico are more sophisticated than the gangs in Central America, but focusing on their finances, focusing not just on the cartel leaders, the kingpins, but middle management, but also doing some shady things like I think also underreporting homicides and hiding homicides, disappearances, just like Bukele has done. Um, but the only countries that have completely got a handle on crime are totalitarian countries. So I talk about this in talks. I ask students, what do you think is the safest country in Latin America? And some people will say, El Salvador, but other people will say, well, maybe it's Uruguay, right? Or maybe it's Chile. And the correct answer is Cuba. Cuba is the safest country in Latin America. Cuba doesn't have problems with gangs. They don't have problems with drug trafficking. Why? Because they shoot drug traffickers, right? They execute them. So, you know, do most people want to live in Cuba? Apparently not. Most people are trying to leave Cuba right now, despite the fact that it's very safe. Because for ordinary Cubans, being safe from crime is not by itself a solution to all the myriad other problems that country has. And so I'm not sure how long people being satisfied with being safe from crime, at least on the streets, uh, at least for now, is going to be. Because we've seen that in the past in El Salvador, and then the crime came back and the economic problems never went away.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. No, that's really, really fascinating to think about the role of the state, and kind of where do we go from here and what are we seeing. Thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it. A pleasure to talk to you. And again, I encourage the audience to read your work. It's terrific. And so thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
Oh, thanks for inviting me. It was a pleasure.